The year was 1835. America was young, restless, and still finding its identity. The streets of Ohio bustled with traders, blacksmiths, and farmers, each carving out a life in a land where progress was fast, but hardships were everywhere. Medicine was primitive, doctors relied more on hope than science, and death was a common visitor in every household. Smallpox, yellow fever, and cholera stalked the living, claiming lives with little warning. Families lived with a shadow of fear. Today, a loved one could be laughing at the dinner table, and tomorrow, cold and still. Amidst this backdrop, a carpenter named James Harrison lived in a small town. Harrison was no ordinary craftsman. While his hands were rough from years of chiseling wood, his mind was sharp and restless. He was deeply troubled by one fear that had spread across the nation, the fear of being buried alive. It might sound like a strange obsession to modern ears, but in the 19th century, this was a real and horrifying possibility. Newspapers carried gruesome stories of families who, days after burying their loved ones, discovered scratch marks on the inside of coffin lids when bodies were later moved. Medical science often declared people dead when they were merely unconscious, in comas, or suffering from illnesses that mimicked death. These stories haunted Harrison. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking himself, "What if I fall asleep and never wake?" Only to wake beneath the ground. Harrison's obsession wasn't born only of fear. It was also born of love. His mother had died suddenly in 1833 during a winter outbreak of fever. She was declared dead within hours of collapsing. Harrison begged the doctor to wait before the burial, but tradition and fear of disease pushed the family to lay her to rest quickly. For years, Harrison wondered if she had truly been gone, or if she had been trapped in a coffin, helpless, her cries unheard. That torment became the seed of his life's strangest work. One evening, as the lamplight flickered in his workshop, Harrison began sketching on rough parchment. His neighbors often came to him for study tables, well-carved chairs, or solid chests, but this time, he wasn't thinking about furniture. He drew a box, a coffin, but unlike any other. He added air vents leading to the surface. Above the headboard, he sketched a small glass window so that mourners could look down and see the face of the departed, not just once but even days later. Then, he added a final detail that would make his invention unforgettable: a bell. A small brass bell would be fixed above the grave, connected to a rope that ran directly into the coffin and tied gently around the hand of the dead. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. If a person woke beneath the ground, they could move their hand, pull the rope, and ring the bell. The sound would echo through the cemetery, summoning the living to rescue them. At first, the invention was a secret he kept to himself, almost ashamed of how far his mind had wandered. But Harrison was a man of conscience. He told himself, if this saves even one soul from such a fate, then the ridicule of the world is worth it. When he finally presented his design to his neighbors, the reaction was not what he hoped. Instead of applause, there was laughter. Men at the tavern called him the Coffin Dreamer, and children in the street sang songs about Harrison's talking dead. Some accused him of being morbid, obsessed with death, and even cursed. They asked why a man who built beautiful tables and chairs would waste his time building a box for corpses. But what they could not see was that Harrison's strange invention was not about death at all. It was about life. It was about respecting the thin thread between the two and ensuring that if fate gave someone one last chance, they would not be denied. Harrison poured his savings into building a prototype. He carved the wood with the precision of an artist, polished the glass until it gleamed, and tested the bell system repeatedly until even the gentlest tug made it ring. He called it the bed of the dead. Unlike the cold, silent coffins used everywhere else, his coffin promised a voice, the voice of the one buried reaching back to the living. This was not just a coffin, it was a challenge to society, a challenge to think differently about fear, safety, and dignity. The 1830s were indeed troubled times, and people clung to tradition. They feared new ideas, especially when it came to something as sacred as burial. But Harrison stood firm. He saw his work as more than wood and rope. It was a shield against premature death, a safeguard for families who might otherwise live with regret. And while the world mocked him, A strange kind of hope stirred in those who listened closely. Mothers who had lost children too soon, widows who doubted the swiftness of a burial, and doctors who secretly questioned their own diagnosis began to whisper that maybe Harrison's invention was not madness, but mercy. Thus, in a time when fear was stronger than reason, one man's strange obsession became a light. A carpenter in Ohio, armed with nothing but wood, rope, and compassion, dared to ask, "What if we could give life one more chance?" And in that daring, Harrison laid the first plank of a legacy that would one day prove that even the strangest inventions can be born from love, and that they can save lives in ways the world never expects. When James Harrison unveiled his invention in 1835, it did not look like an ordinary coffin. Yes, it was carved from wood, shaped like the resting box every family eventually required, but there was something different about it. Where others saw a final prison, Harrison saw a second chance. He believed a coffin should not only mark the end of life, but should also serve as a bridge back to it. If destiny allowed, he began by calling it not just a coffin but a safety chamber. For Harrison, names mattered to him. Coffin implied hopelessness, silence, and eternal stillness. But chamber suggested possibility, as if the person within was not entirely gone but only resting. His neighbors thought him eccentric, but Harrison clung to his vision. The most striking part of Harrison's coffin was the ventilation system. He drilled discreet holes along the lid, each connected to narrow copper pipes that rose above the earth. The pipes were designed to allow fresh air to flow in and stale air to escape. Though simple, this feature carried immense symbolic weight. It was not only about breathing, it was about hope. Where other coffins suffocated, Harrison's allowed the possibility of survival. Then came the glass window. Set into the head of the coffin, it allowed family members to look in after burial. In an age when medical science could not always determine whether someone was truly dead, this small pane of glass became a window of reassurance. Families could peer down and confirm the stillness or, if miracle permitted, catch the flicker of life in a face thought gone. Finally, there was the bell rope, a simple mechanism, yet one that captured the imagination more than anything else. The rope ran from the coffin through a hole in the earth and connected to a bell fixed on a metal frame above the grave. Inside the coffin, the rope was tied loosely around the wrist of the occupant. If the dead stirred, their natural movement would set the bell ringing. The sound, Harrison hoped, would summon the living before it was too late. To demonstrate, Harrison often lay inside the coffin himself, tugged the rope, and let the bell clang in the air. "See," he would tell skeptical neighbors, "if I were alive down there, you would hear me up here." Children found it amusing. Some adults shivered at the sound, but Harrison, calm and determined, treated the demonstration as sacred. To him, this was not play, it was protection. While others dismissed his invention as macabre, Harrison believed it carried a message. He was not obsessed with death, as many accused. He was obsessed with the dignity of life. To him, no one deserved to be abandoned to the earth while breath still lingered in their lungs. Every detail of his coffin spoke of love for humanity. The polished wood, carefully varnished, symbolized respect. The air vents symbolized mercy. The glass window symbolized vigilance. And the bell symbolized faith, that even when all seemed lost, a voice might still call out. It was, in truth, a coffin that was more than a coffin. It was a statement that even in death, people deserved one final safeguard, one last chance at being heard. The community, however, did not immediately see it that way. Some mocked him, calling the contraption the chattering box or the fool's coffin. A few whispered that Harrison was cursed, haunted by his mother's early burial, and that his obsession was unhealthy. Clergymen muttered that death was God's will and should not be interfered with. But there were others who looked at the coffin and felt something stir within. A widow whose husband had been buried swiftly after a fever confessed she wished such a coffin had existed earlier. Parents of sickly children spoke in hushed tones about the comfort of knowing there might be one last safeguard. And a few physicians, honest enough to admit their fallibility, began to take an interest. Still, the invention did not sell easily. People feared being the first to embrace what others mocked. Harrison's workshop was filled with unfinished coffins, prototypes stacked one upon another. Yet Harrison did not give up. He polished, improved, and rebuilt. Let them laugh, he told himself. If even one person's life is spared, this will be worth it. Harrison's coffin became, unintentionally, a metaphor for perseverance itself. It reminded people that the line between defeat and survival was often thin, and that preparation, even if mocked, could be the difference. Harrison turned fear into foresight and ridicule into resilience. In time, his invention began to draw interest beyond his town. Traveling merchants carried word of the coffin with a bell, and the story reached other states. Some wealthy families ordered one not because they believed they would need it, but because it gave them peace of mind. Gradually, what was once ridicule began to turn into recognition. The coffin, with its vents, window, and bell, was not just a wooden box anymore. It was a lesson in courage, courage to challenge tradition, courage to protect life at all costs, and courage to face mockery for a vision that others could not yet understand. Looking back, the genius of Harrison's invention lay not only in its mechanics but in its philosophy. A coffin, in his mind, was not the end of hope. It could be the cradle of a second chance. Where society saw finality, Harrison saw possibility. Where others saw fear, Harrison saw responsibility. And this is why his creation was more than a coffin. It was an act of defiance against despair. It whispered to the world, do not abandon life too quickly. Do not bury possibility. Always give hope one last chance to breathe. When James Harrison first set his invention in the town square of Ohio in 1835, the people didn't know whether to laugh or to be afraid. It looked like a coffin, yes, but it was not the same silent wooden box that they had seen countless times carried to the graveyard. This one was different. It seemed alive with strange details. A glass window set near the head, metal pipes that stretched upward like thin chimneys, and a rope that disappeared into the earth and ended at a little brass bell. Harrison stood beside it proudly, his carpenter's hands resting on the polished wood. This, he declared to a gathering of curious onlookers, is not just a coffin. This is a safeguard. This is a bed for the dead that might still live. The crowd murmured. Some shook their heads, others chuckled, but a few leaned forward, captivated. What Harrison had built was more than a coffin. It was an act of mercy, born out of fear, love, and the desire to give life one more chance. The first remarkable feature of Harrison's coffin was its ventilation system. He had carefully carved holes into the lid and connected them with slender copper pipes that extended above ground. If a man is wrongly buried, Harrison explained, he must have air. At the time, medical science was unreliable. People who fainted, fell into comas, or slipped into the stillness of fever were often mistaken for dead. Families buried their loved ones quickly, fearing disease, and only later, when graves were reopened for various reasons, did they discover the truth. Coffin lids had been found with deep claw marks, a silent testament to horror beneath the soil. Harrison's coffin, however, defied that fate. It offered breath in a place where no breath was thought possible. To many it seemed strange. Why give air to the dead? But Harrison insisted, because sometimes the dead are not dead. The second feature was the glass window at the head of the coffin. No longer would a grieving family have to trust blindly that their beloved was gone. Days after the burial, they could look down through the pane and see with their own eyes. Harrison believed this would bring peace of mind. To him, the window was not just glass. It was a promise that the living would not abandon their watch too soon, that they would remain vigilant, and that they would not turn their backs on one who might yet stir. Some called the idea disturbing. Who would wish to gaze upon a corpse days after burial? They asked. But Harrison replied softly, better a moment of discomfort for the living than eternal torment for one buried too soon. The most famous feature of Harrison's coffin was the bell. A simple rope, tied gently to the wrist of the occupant, stretched upward to a brass bell above the grave. Even the faintest twitch of the hand would set it ringing. When Harrison demonstrated, lying inside his creation and tugging the rope, the bell clanged in the open air. Children gasped, women clutched their shawls, and men laughed nervously. The sound of a bell above a grave was unsettling. It carried a message that perhaps the dead were not truly gone. But Harrison saw it differently. To him, the bell was the voice of the forgotten, the sound of a soul insisting on one more chance. "It is not a bell for the dead," he told them, "but for the living, to remind them not to give up hope." At first, most townsfolk mocked him. They whispered that his mind was broken after his mother's sudden death 2 years earlier. Others said he was trying to profit from fear. Yet, behind their ridicule, something deeper stirred. His coffin planted a seed of unease. For every man who scoffed in public, there was a woman at home who whispered, "What if he is right?" Slowly, a few families began to consider it. Those who had lost children suddenly, or who had buried loved ones in haste, began to see the invention not as madness but as mercy. The ridicule of the many could not erase the quiet gratitude of the few. Harrison's coffin was not merely an object. It was a philosophy carved into wood. Every vent, every window, every rope was a reminder that life is precious, fragile, and deserving of protection even when all seems lost. To Harrison, the coffin was not about fearing death. It was about honoring life. He knew people thought him strange, but he embraced it. Better to be strange and save a soul, he often said, than to be ordinary and bury hope with the body. His invention carried a deeper lesson, that love can turn even fear into innovation. His grief for his mother, his terror of premature burial, became the driving force behind a creation that could save others. He had transformed personal pain into public good. In time, news of the coffin with a bell spread beyond Harrison's little town. Merchants spoke of it in neighboring counties. Physicians, who knew too well the fallibility of their diagnosis, began to take quiet interest. Wealthy families, eager to protect their own, began to order them. It was no longer merely a coffin. It was a symbol of foresight, of compassion, of daring to challenge the ordinary. Harrison had taken what others saw as morbid obsession and turned it into a gift of safety. The Harrison coffin reminds us that the most unusual ideas are often born from love and persistence. What began as the private torment of one man became an invention that saved lives and gave families comfort. It was more than a coffin. It was a lesson that ridicule should never silence vision, a lesson that fear, when shaped with courage, can become a force for good, and a lesson that even in the shadow of death, one can carve out hope. For months after James Harrison built his strange coffin, his invention stood mostly as a curiosity. People gossiped about it, laughed at it, and only a few quietly admired it. Harrison himself lived between hope and despair, often wondering whether his work would ever be truly tested. He had built the bed of the dead to give life one more chance, but until the coffin was used in reality, it remained only an idea, a dream carved in wood. That test came sooner than anyone expected. In the bitter winter of 1836, a fever swept through the county. It moved from house to house, leaving families in mourning. Doctors struggled, their remedies weak against the invisible enemy. Among the victims was Eliza Montgomery, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. At just 19 years old, she was full of life, with hair like golden wheat and a laugh that often filled her father's home. But within a week of catching the fever, she collapsed and fell into a stillness that resembled death. Her pulse grew faint, her skin turned pale, and her breathing was shallow. The doctor, after hours of observation, declared her gone. The grief-stricken family prepared for burial, but Eliza's father, a man who had once listened intently to Harrison describe his invention, remembered the strange coffin with the bell. Though mocked by many, it now seemed like a lifeline. Neighbors urged the Montgomerys to proceed with a traditional burial. "Why place her in that contraption?" they asked. "She is gone, let her rest." But Mr. Montgomery was haunted by doubt. He could not shake the image of his daughter's chest, which seemed to rise ever so slightly, or the faint warmth that still lingered in her hands. "If there is even a chance," he told his wife, "I will not bury our daughter alive." Against criticism, he sought out Harrison. The carpenter, though saddened by the girl's condition, was determined. He personally oversaw the placement of Eliza in the safety coffin. With careful hands, he tied the bell rope gently to her wrist, ensuring that the slightest movement could summon help. Above the fresh grave, the brass bell gleamed under the winter sky. The burial was somber, attended by friends and townsfolk who whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads at the Montgomerys' decision, muttering that grief had clouded their reason. But Harrison stood near the grave, solemn and firm. He believed. That night a heavy snow fell. The cemetery lay silent, the bell unmoving. The Montgomery family remained sleepless, staring out the window, listening for a sound they both dreaded and longed for. Harrison, too, stayed awake, pacing in his workshop, every creak of the wood reminding him of the coffin he had built. It happened just before dawn. In the stillness of the morning, as the first light touched the horizon, a sharp, metallic sound cut through the silence. Clang! Then again. Clang! Clang! The bell above Eliza's grave rang wildly. The groundskeeper, who had been making his early rounds, froze in terror. For a moment, he thought it was the wind or some trick of his mind. But the bell continued, urgent and desperate. He ran to the Montgomery home, shouting. The family rushed into the snow-covered graveyard, joined by Harrison, who had sprinted from his workshop at the first word. Hearts pounded, breaths froze in the air, and hands trembled as shovels struck the ground. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, gathered around in awe and fear. When the coffin was unearthed and the lid lifted, they saw Eliza, weak, pale, but alive. Her eyes fluttered open, her lips moved faintly, and her hands still twitched against the rope that had saved her life. The doctor who had pronounced her dead stood speechless. The crowd gasped, some falling to their knees in prayer. Eliza was carried back to her home, where over the next days she slowly regained strength. The bell, still hanging above the grave, became a symbol of triumph over despair. For Harrison, it was the vindication he had waited for. His obsession, once a source of ridicule, had proven its worth in the most dramatic way possible. The coffin was no longer just an odd invention. It was a savior. News spread quickly, carried in newspapers and by word of mouth. Young woman saved by coffin bell, one headline proclaimed. People who once mocked Harrison now spoke his name with respect. Families who had dismissed his invention began to seek him out. Orders for safety coffins came from neighboring towns, and doctors, humbled by their own limitations, recommended them for patients who died suddenly or under mysterious circumstances. The Montgomery family, eternally grateful, declared Harrison a hero. Mr. Montgomery often said, "He did not only save my daughter's life, he saved my family's soul." Eliza herself, when recovered, visited Harrison to thank him personally. With tears in her eyes, she told him, "You gave me a second life." This event was more than just proof of his invention. It was the turning point of Harrison's life. No longer did he have to argue or defend himself endlessly. The bell that rang in the snowy dawn had silenced his critics. But for Harrison, it was never about fame or profit. He felt a deeper calling to protect life, to honor the fragile line between death and survival. If one life has been saved, he told the townsfolk, then every moment of ridicule, every coin I spent, every night I lay awake in fear, was worth it. The story of Eliza Montgomery's rescue became legendary in the county. Parents told it to children as proof that miracles happen when courage meets persistence. For many, it was a lesson in never surrendering to despair too soon, in questioning certainty, and in giving life one more chance before closing the door forever. For Harrison, the saved life was not just Eliza's. It was a life saved from ridicule, a vision saved from obscurity, and a message saved for generations. That innovation born of love and persistence can turn mockery into salvation. When the bell above Eliza Montgomery's grave rang in the snowy dawn of 1836, it did more than save a young woman's life. It saved James Harrison's reputation. The carpenter who had been ridiculed as the coffin dreamer was suddenly spoken of with reverence. Overnight, he transformed from the village eccentric to a man of vision. What had once been dismissed as madness was now hailed as foresight. For months, Harrison had endured ridicule. Men at the tavern mimicked the sound of his bell. Women gossiped about his morbid obsession, and children sang cruel songs about coffins that talked. But after Eliza's rescue, the laughter stopped. The very same men who mocked him now nodded respectfully when he passed. Mothers who once pulled their children away from his shop now greeted him warmly, whispering gratitude for his courage. Harrison himself did not gloat. He carried no bitterness. Instead, he remained humble, telling anyone who praised him, "Do not thank me. Thank the bell that gave your ears a chance to hear, and thank God for the second breath he gave the girl." No one was more grateful than the Montgomery family. Eliza's father, who had been ridiculed for choosing Harrison's coffin, now walked with renewed pride. He openly declared, "This man has preserved my family's joy. I would have buried my daughter alive if not for his vision." Mrs. Montgomery, overwhelmed by emotion, visited Harrison's workshop with food and gifts. Though he accepted little, Eliza herself, still weak but recovering, became a living testament to his invention. Her survival was proof that Harrison's bed of the dead was no fantasy but a lifeline. When she finally regained full strength, she often told her story in gatherings, always ending with, "I owe my life to the bell that rang, and to the man who believed enough to make it possible." The incident shook not just families but also doctors and clergy. Physicians, who had long been accused of pronouncing death too hastily, found themselves humbled. They could no longer ignore the possibility of error. Some began to cautiously endorse Harrison's invention, suggesting safety coffins as a precaution for sudden or unexplained deaths. Clergymen, too, were forced to reconsider their earlier criticism. Where once they had argued that interfering with burial was defying God's will, now they admitted that perhaps Harrison's creation was part of God's providence. "If the Lord grants a soul another breath," one minister said during a Sunday sermon, "ought we not to provide the means for that breath to be taken?" Before Eliza's rescue, Harrison could hardly persuade anyone to buy his coffins. Now, requests began to pour in. Wealthy families in neighboring towns sent letters asking for the coffin with the bell. Merchants, sensing opportunity, offered to transport and sell them in larger cities. Harrison, though never greedy, realized that his small workshop was becoming the center of something far larger than he had imagined. He worked tirelessly, shaping wood, polishing glass, and perfecting his designs. Each coffin was made with the same care and reverence as the first. For Harrison, every coffin represented a promise that no one would be abandoned too soon to the silence of the grave. Word of Harrison's invention spread beyond Ohio. Newspapers carried stories of the safety coffin carpenter, praising his ingenuity. Journalists described the Montgomery rescue in dramatic detail, turning Harrison into a household name. In towns where he was unknown, people spoke of him with admiration, often repeating the tale as though it were a parable. Once mocked, now honored. Once called a fool, now called a savior. His invention also sparked debate across America. Some hailed it as a necessary safeguard, while others argued it was unnecessary superstition. But even the skeptics could not deny the truth. A young woman had been saved because of Harrison's foresight. The newfound respect changed Harrison's daily life. Where once he walked with head bowed under the weight of mockery, now he walked with quiet confidence. Yet, he remained the same humble carpenter at heart. He continued to mend chairs, build tables, and carve ordinary coffins for those who wanted them. But for those who asked for the bed of the dead, he gave extra attention, knowing that these creations carried more than wood and rope. They carried hope. Children no longer sang cruel songs. Instead, they asked him to tell the story of the bell. Some even tugged at the rope in his workshop, listening to the chime, their eyes wide with awe. To them, Harrison was not strange but heroic. Respect came not only in the form of orders and praise but also in a deeper, quieter recognition. Harrison's neighbors began to see him not as a man obsessed with death, but as a man deeply committed to life. They understood, finally, that his invention was not about coffins but about compassion. The bell above Eliza's grave had done more than ring. It had awakened the hearts of a community. It taught them that ridicule can blind us to wisdom, and that sometimes the very ideas we laugh at hold the power to save us. By 1837, Harrison's coffins were being used in several counties. Though not everyone purchased them, the very idea had changed how people thought about burial. Families grew more cautious, doctors more hesitant, and society as a whole more respectful of the thin line between life and death. Harrison never sought fame. He often said, "It is enough to know that the living are safer than they were before." Yet, whether he wished it or not. He had become a figure of inspiration. His name stood for persistence in the face of mockery, vision in the face of doubt, and compassion in the face of fear. The respect and recognition James Harrison earned were not merely for an invention, they were for a way of living. He taught his community that true innovation often looks strange before it looks wise. He proved that perseverance in the face of ridicule can lead to breakthroughs that save lives. Most importantly, he showed that respect is not demanded, it is earned through service, sacrifice, and unwavering belief in a purpose greater than oneself. By the late 1830s, James Harrison's invention had already saved at least one life, sparked countless debates, and transformed his reputation from ridicule to respect. Yet the true weight of his story was not in the wood, the glass, or the bell. It was in the moral message his life carried. What began as an obsession, born from fear and grief, had become an enduring source of inspiration. When Harrison first began building his safety coffin, many called him mad. His workshop was filled with laughter from those who mocked him, and whispers from neighbors who claimed his obsession with premature burial was unhealthy. To them, his nights spent sketching designs, testing ropes, and carving wood for something so unusual were a waste of time. But history has always drawn a fine line between madness and vision. What appears foolish in one moment can become groundbreaking in another. Harrison's obsession was not truly madness. It was foresight. He dared to confront a fear others ignored, and in doing so, he turned his private terror into a gift for humanity. This teaches us something powerful. What others dismiss as obsession may be the seed of inspiration if nurtured with persistence. Harrison's driving force was fear, fear of being buried alive, fear born from personal grief over his mother's sudden burial. But instead of allowing fear to paralyze him, he transformed it into purpose. Fear, when left unchecked, can destroy a life. But when harnessed with creativity and courage, it can become fuel for change. Harrison proved that even our deepest anxieties can be reshaped into acts of compassion. His coffin was not built merely to ease his own worry, it was built to protect others from the same fate. This is a lesson that resonates far beyond 1835. Every generation faces fears, whether of failure, poverty, rejection, or death itself. The choice is always the same: do we allow fear to bury us, or do we carve it into something that gives others hope? Another moral from Harrison's story is the role of ridicule in the journey toward innovation. For months, he endured laughter, insults, and doubt. The very people who later honored him had once mocked him most. If Harrison had given up under that pressure, Eliza Montgomery would likely have been buried alive, and his invention would have died in his workshop. But his refusal to yield reminds us of a vital truth. Ridicule is often the tax innovators must pay before the world recognizes their worth. How many great ideas have been lost because their creators feared laughter? How many lives could have been changed if someone had endured mockery long enough for their vision to prove itself? Harrison's story tells us, stand firm. The jeers of today may become the applause of tomorrow. Some inventions change the world by saving millions, others change it by saving just one. Harrison's coffin proved its value when Eliza Montgomery's bell rang in the snowy dawn. That one life, spared from premature death, justified all of Harrison's sleepless nights and years of ridicule. It reminds us that we should never underestimate the value of a single life. To save one person is to save a family's joy, a community's hope, and perhaps even generations yet unborn. Harrison's story illustrates that the worth of our work is not always measured in numbers, but in impact. Though the safety coffin itself would evolve and eventually fade with advancements in medical science, the legacy of Harrison's work was never just about the device. His true contribution was a mindset, a way of looking at fear, persistence, and innovation. By insisting that life deserved one more chance even in the grave, Harrison made people more cautious, more vigilant, and more compassionate. Doctors became slower to declare death. Families became more attentive. Society became more aware of the fragile line between life and death. His coffin may have been a wooden box, but his message was timeless: never bury hope too quickly. The transformation of Harrison's story, from obsession to inspiration, offers us a guiding moral. We all carry obsessions of some kind: a fear, a dream, an idea others call foolish. What matters is what we do with them. Harrison's obsession could have consumed him. Instead, he shaped it into an invention that saved lives. In the process, he inspired his community and earned respect that no ridicule could erase. His life demonstrates that obsession, when guided by compassion and persistence, is not a weakness but a strength. In the end, The Bed of the Dead was never just about coffins or bells. It was about vision, courage, and the refusal to let life be silenced too soon. Harrison's story teaches us a fear can be reshaped into purpose. The ridicule is often the path to recognition. Even saving one life can justify years of struggle. A true respect is earned not through words, but through service. But what begins as obsession can, through persistence, become inspiration. These are not lessons bound to 1835, they are eternal. They remind us in every generation to hold fast to our visions, to endure mockery, and to remember that even the smallest act of courage can ripple through time. James Harrison may have been a carpenter, but his legacy was not built of wood. It was built of faith, persistence, and compassion. The coffin he created was more than a vessel for the dead. It was a vessel of hope for the living. His story urges us to look at our own lives and ask, what obsession have I abandoned because others laughed? What fear have I allowed to bury my courage? And what dream, if I pursued it, could one day inspire others? The answer to those questions is the true moral of Harrison's tale. For every person who dares to turn obsession into purpose, there lies the possibility of transforming ridicule into respect and fear into inspiration.